All right, good evening, listeners. Welcome to Motley Crude, episode number 32. I'm Kevin, and this evening with me, I've got Andrew. How you doing, man?
Good, how's it going, buddy?
Pretty good, pretty good. Unfortunately, Ryan couldn't join us, which is fine. We're still going to have a grand old time here talking about terrain in the old world. We're going to be talking about everything from how it impacts our games to acquiring and painting it up. So we're going to be doing a full terrain related episode. Before we get to that, however, let's do some what's new in your hobby. Let's kick off with you, Andrew.
Haven't really had time to get games in. Big surprise. But I did paint up a bunch of dark elf shades, and
Nice.
I made a custom baggage train for my army in lead
Nice.
up to the tournament this coming weekend at the Red Dragon. And then I got a bunch of more terrain done for CCBB. I finished one of the tables out of the 5 I was gonna make, with the other 4 kind of in various stages of complete or almost complete. So
Okay. Okay, cool. Like your baggage train, is that, did you use like the old Cauldron of Blood, like the, is it sixth ed or whatever Cauldron of Blood?
it's an STL I found
Ah,
of
okay.
someone who made it. Like, it looks pretty damn close, but it's not like an actual scan. It's just someone made
Okay.
the file look pretty much like it. So that I used that, and then the witches that came with that specific print look a little dog shit.
Okay.
So I used old 6th ed witches on that to
Ah,
make it
okay.
look a little better.
Nice. Nice. It looks
The
good.
one
Yeah, it looks good.
the
Sorry?
ones with the sausage hair or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Good old sausage hair. Classic. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
And then are you settled on your list for the tournament this weekend?
Pretty much. I just need to pick a lore of magic for my wizard.
Okay.
Um, I'll probably still go with battle, but now
Yeah.
that Pillar of Fire isn't that great anymore, I'm kind of looking at some of the others again. Like, I might go Shadows and just try to get Miasmic Mirage.
Illusion
Uh,
is yeah.
Illusion, yeah, sorry, not
Yeah.
Shadows. Um, but I'm not sure. I'm still kind of tinkering with it. I have until Saturday morning.
Yeah. With
But
the lists are super late for that when they're like basically when the event starts, so you've got plenty of time.
yeah, so I'm
But isn't
gonna.
what level of caster are you taking? Because like miasmic mirage and stuff is going to be super hard to cast now.
Well, I'm taking a level 4.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I
We'll
don't
we'll
know.
see. Yeah, we'll see. It's
Also,
a good time to test it out. Yeah.
and if I drop her down, I don't know, cause like I give her the lore familiar, so I don't have to roll.
Yeah.
But the Dark Elves have a magic item. I think it's like 40 points. I used to take it a lot. Maybe it's 50 points. But when you cast, you roll 3 dice, pick the 2 highest,
Okay.
as
Nice.
opposed. But if any of them are a double, then you miscast. But
Okay.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
something
So
I'm
so
willing to risk, I guess, to
yeah,
power through some spells. But then I lose the ability to pick my spells because they're not common
yeah.
magic items.
Hmm.
And to fit that magic item in, probably have to drop her down to like a level 3.
Okay. Yeah.
So I probably just leave it as is, but I'm still trying to figure out which lore to take.
Yeah, that's it's a bit of a tough one too. If you don't have the lore familiar and illusion, like there's some really good spells and there's some dog shit spells in that lore too. So it's
Yeah.
a rough one to dry roll on. And yeah, so maybe battle magic. I don't know. I'll see. We'll see
Yeah.
Saturday, I guess.
Yeah.
Also, battle is easier to cast too than illusion for the most part.
That's
So there's
true. They're a
that.
little bit lower.
Yeah, I think battle magic and elementalism are the lowest ones. I think, but anyways, certainly battle magic. Cool, yeah. And then you getting excited for that event? Play some games in the new FAQ like version and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. Like, I really didn't make. I think I've sent you a copy of my list so far, or like I did it in our group chat thing.
Oh yeah, in our group chat, yes.
I didn't make any like super crazy changes to my list. I did drop the dragon and put my dreadlord on a chariot instead, and then I gave the hag the cauldron of blood. Since the cauldron's abilities are now a lot easier to get off
Yeah.
without being dispelled because they're just bound power spells.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna see how that works out. I'm not super sure if it's that was the best move because it does take away like a big high strength piece, even if it
Yeah.
isn't gonna like be able to solo like units and shit now. It's still like one of the major sources of high strength attacks in that army.
Hmm.
Um, so I might have shot myself in the foot there a bit, but I'll see how it goes. And just it'll be interesting to see how it performs given the new mission types and everything from the
Yeah.
match play guide.
Yeah, I'm super excited to see like what kinds of lists people bring, like how hard they skewed or they turned around and like just jumped into the new meta, which we have no idea about exactly at this point in time. So like I'm super excited to see what people bring. I've made some changes, I made some changes to my list. Primarily, like my core has shifted a lot. I'm doing hobgoblins now, so apparently I've got like 3 units of hobgoblins, just because when you're talking about a 4 point model that's on a 4 up armor save, strength 3, toughness 3, weapon skill 3 there, that you can give other buffs to, this like static combat res 5 for like 170 points or something, like 38 of them or whatever. Like it's hard to pass up on that kind of a unit when you look at how expensive the other sort of core options that I have are. So it's mainly my core that has shifted. I'm still taking mostly the flying circus, but made some a few other changes. It might be my last time though taking the baby Tauruses, just because they've kind of gotten double nerfed recently. So, firstly, losing. So, the last FAQ had Furious Charge no longer apply from the rider and to the mount and back and forth there, and the baby Taurus or all the Tauruses actually gave Furious Charge to their riders, which was great. So that was like the first kick that they took. And then we had and I'll talk about this in the news in a few seconds there, but like we had also the beta 1.5 version of the Renegades pack drop today. And the Great Tauruses also got a bit of a nerf there. They became monstrous creatures where they used to be behemoths, as per GW rules, which means that they lose AP on their stomps. So I mean, those two together, with the changing shift towards high combat res, high armor save infantry, is probably means I'm going to have to shift again my list. But it's maybe a longer discussion for another time.
Did they lead? Does
Yeah.
the big Taurus still have
Yeah,
behemoth?
it does. Yeah, it does. The Bill
Okay.
Taurus is still a behemoth. It's just
Okay.
that you've got to take the Lord level characters to be able to take that, and then that more than doubles the points on one, right? So
Gotcha.
yeah, so it may be an option to go Bill Taurus and Wyvern, for instance, but I just want to see how this new infantry meta plays on the table a little bit more before I sort of make that call. Yeah,
Makes
so we'll see.
sense.
Um, Okay, and then aside from that, from like a hobby perspective, for me, I got back from vacation like 3 or 4 days ago, so I haven't done a ton of hobbies since I got back. Like, not really any serious painting or anything. I've been putting together my list for this weekend, so I have like as I mentioned, 3 units of hobgoblins. So I had to build like the movement trays and get the models ready. I'm going to be proxying the third unit with like night goblins and stuff, just because they haven't showed up yet. I've ordered a bunch of additional hobgoblins; they haven't showed up yet. Um, so
What
yeah,
models are you using for them?
the Fabizel ones.
Oh yeah, right on.
Yeah, it's the same. They're basically like a recreation of the very old school, like fourth edition Chaos Dwarf Hobgoblins, and they're the
Yeah,
same ones I
yeah.
use for like my riders and stuff.
I know the guy. I downloaded a bunch of his
Oh, okay.
STLs.
Fuck, I shouldn't got you to print it then instead of order it from halfway around the world. But yeah,
Yeah, you should have.
I should have. Yeah, and then aside from that, I played a single game since our last episode into Bretonian Exiles for like the S-Bot Online. I was bringing a flying skew list, and this was like the old version of the game. So I just got Falconhorned, and I basically sat there all game. Didn't really move. I was super passive, unfortunately, because most of my army was flying, and just got shot by cannons all game, and my opponent didn't charge me. So it was not a very interesting game, and it was a loss too. So yeah, cool. That's that. So in terms of news, a few items. So we've got the big GW summer preview in 2 days from now on Friday. So maybe we'll record an episode after that preview if there's noteworthy material to talk of. For instance, a whole new Chaos Dwarf line would be interesting, and whatever else is announced for the old world. Andrew, you weren't here on the last show we recorded. What are your thoughts on what's going to be previewed for the old world at the summer preview?
Given just sort of the roller coaster releases we just had, my guess it'll probably be something pretty tame.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Probably like a preview of the next AJ for Cathay. Um, Maybe a couple of the, I don't know, special characters that are missing from like some of the
Sure,
previous AJs. But I don't think it's anything going to be super hot and heavy like it has been, especially probably not a new faction. It would be nice if I'm wrong though, but I
for
just
sure.
given how much we've gotten in the past like 5 months, 6 months, like I don't see them having super or a lot left in the tank in terms of like cutting edge new stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely on this one. I think like sort of it's probably going to be Cathay stuff is the sort of boring answer, and then if I'm getting a little bit more ambitious here, I say that probably maybe the redacted AJ Arcane Journal there that they've talked about or they've hinted at, maybe they may talk about that one. But that one wouldn't be, like you said, a new army or anything like that. It would probably just be one of those um, arcane journals that they've mentioned in the past, which could be about like a specific battle or something, and it would support existing factions, is how I see that. So I think it's between one of those two. And then if we get like another character, like a kick snake or whatever, that'd be great for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So yeah, and then the other news item is, of course, the again I mentioned earlier, the 1.5 version of the Renegades pack is out. If people are looking to use that and are using that and looking to see what the changes are like, it's pretty minimal stuff, generally speaking, except for ogres, which have had a pretty significant shift. Okay, let's talk terrain. All right, Andrew, let's start. Let's start off, obviously, with you here. What are your thoughts, like overall, on how impactful and sort of well implemented terrain is in the old world? Do you think the old world is a game where terrain is really like the proverbial third player, or do you think it's mainly like a cosmetic thing?
I think it's probably somewhere in between. Like I don't think terrain can be very impactful in your game, especially placement and stuff, but I don't
Yeah,
think it's super integral to the overall game, and it's still more dependent on how the players play on the table. And a lot of the times, the main stuff happens in the open. So I think terrain does play an impact, but it isn't like the be all end all. Like, unless, the players have done something ridiculous with terrain setup, like it will somewhat impact how the game goes, but it's not going to drastically change the outcome of the game. That's based on what the players are doing with their armies.
yeah. No, I agree with you on this one. You said like it's in between, and I think that's how I would also describe it. Like it's impactful, but not too much. I think it generally, like compared to other games for the old world, it depends on how shooting centric your game is my position on how impactful terrain is. If you've got a game where everything gets gunned down quite easily, perhaps modern 40K or something like that, then having a lot of terrain is really critical, and effective terrain is really critical in making sure you can actually have a game and it's not just a duck shoot. However, the old world is definitely not in that space. Like, shooting is impactful in the game, but it's not a shooting centric game system. So yeah, for that reason, I agree with you that it's like terrain is sort of a mid level of impact compared to other games for sure. Um, Cool. Next one, Andrew. Like, just thinking about the current set of rules that govern like terrain in the game. The difficult, dangerous terrain types, the 6 main types of terrain, or what have you, like open terrain, forests, difficult, dangerous, low linear obstacles, that kind of stuff there. And then the few extra special buildings that we have, like the arcane monolith. Like, do you think this is a good system of rules? Like, is it too much, not enough? Like, what's your feeling on the actual crunchy rules?
Overall, I think it's pretty good. They all kind of have their own unique flavor in how they impact units interacting with them, or in some cases, preventing any sort of interaction if you're talking about like line of sight blocking stuff
Yeah,
or impassable terrain. Um, so I do think, they are generally pretty interesting, and I wouldn't want them to go too much more deeper into their effects on the game itself. Like I think they have that kind of right level of, yeah, they do kind of make a difference, but it's not like drastically different. Um I do, maybe we'll get into this later, but I do think like to have a proper game of Old World, you should probably have at least one of each terrain type, so you have that mix on the
sure.
table. Because I think it would get a little boring if, say, the whole table was just 5 pieces of impassable terrain. It might
Yeah.
look cool because it'll be like fighting in a city, but I think that's really boring. I
Mhm.
think you need that kind of mix so you have options on how you move around the table and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right on that last point, and we'll get to it later there, but definitely like they have different tactical uses for the players, like a forest compared to impassable terrain. So I agree with you that there needs to be a good mix, for sure. I think like overall, I'm happy with the terrain system in game. I think the most important thing with a war game terrain system overall is that it needs to be simple, so that like players are not wasting any bandwidth and too much time and forgetting different terrain rules. Like, the best example I can give is when Warhammer Fantasy Battles got shit canned and replaced with Age of Sigmar in the first edition. I switched to that game, and you had to roll like basically on a table for each and every single piece of terrain in game for like what its effects were. So like, is that forest this game dangerous, mystical, or heroic, or what have you? And then they gave different sort of rules to the piece of terrain, and it was just too much, and nobody could ever sort of remember it. So yeah, the point being, the system needs to be simple. I think the system in the old world is simple enough and has enough nuance to it that it's fun, and it's like it supports the game well. I think there's maybe even a little bit too much when you start talking about like the special buildings or whatever, like the arcane monoliths and what have you in the tower and all that kind of stuff that are sort of buried in the rules that nobody uses, but they're super optional. So I'm kind of fine with it anyways. So yeah, I'm happy with it. In terms of Andrew, in terms of the current system, is there anything you'd like to see changed in the future?
Um, I would I would like them to ease up the radius in the center of the table. Um, Having that, what, 24-inch
It's
circle?
Yeah, it's a 12 inches from the middle, so 24. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a little big. Unless you're playing sort of like King of the Hill. Um,
sure.
I don't think it really impacts having, a couple pieces a little closer. I know we've toyed around in our events with having a 6-inch radius. So nothing within 6 inches of the center. I think that worked fairly well. It made the tables just look a little bit more interesting. It also gave you options on sort of, ways to move around the table. Um, I just find like with the current way it's set up, it kind of funnels players into just like, well, let's push everything into the center and see how it shakes out, as opposed to sort of using the terrain to, skirt around, get some flanks going, try to outplay your opponent. So
Mhm.
other than that, that's my only like super big thing I would change. I kind of like the system as is. Um, Even with like the player placed rules, like it's not the most elegant system, but I think it's probably the most fair, just giving players the option to sort of
Yeah,
each one place a piece. Um, if we're talking about tournaments, I still think like the gold standard would be, tournament TO placed, or like,
yeah,
having a map set up for the tables. But
agreed.
I think that takes a lot of bandwidth on the TO to do it properly, and to also like monitor the tables to make sure, during the game, if someone moved the wall or a building to get access to models or something, to make sure they're placed back properly for the next game. So that just takes a little bit more effort on the TOs.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you. That's probably, well, it is my favorite way of like placing terrain at an event, just because it cuts down time, and like, and
Yeah,
I don't want to spend
100%.
too much time deploying, right? But like I do understand the additional burden. I think overall, like the not being able to put any terrain as per like the rules in the GW book, not being able to put any terrain in the middle of the board is a huge miss. I can't believe I hadn't thought about it until you started talking, but like that one is massive. I think it leads to all the terrain being on the outsides, and it leads to your games being a little bit samey in terms of the like how you can maneuver on the board, and just making that change of being able to put terrain anywhere, really like I think it makes things more dynamic, because some games you're going to be split, like the middle will be sort of blocked up, and your armies will be split on either side, and others the middle will be a nice open lane. So at least it gives you more, I think it gives you more ways to play for sure. um and yeah, I agree with you also, like Andrew, that player place terrain and is a fairly solid system, and how GW has articulated it. Yeah, so no, I think we're generally in agreement. So, but yeah, change the middle of the board thing. I don't think that helped. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So let's talk a little bit more about like terrain from a sort of a tactical perspective, or how like you move around it, how you use it, and yeah, and how it impacts like units and stuff. So, um, first off, you talked about it a little bit in your last answer there with player place versus TO place, but let's say we're talking about player place terrain. Like, how do you approach terrain placement with regards to like your army? Like, does your army impact how you place terrain? Is this something you think about, all that kind of stuff? And then, how do you also look at like picking sides? And then, does terrain affect your game plan when you get to the table? That kind of stuff.
Um, this is a little bit harder to answer. The answer, like the TLDR, is yes, it impacts how I approach the game I'm about to play. Depending on, how the terrain is set up. Um, but it's really hard to have like a general rule of thumb, because I kind of have to make that decision in the moment based on how the
Yeah.
table's set up. So when I am trying to set up, I try to break up, say, using our kind of local meta standard of two hills, two forests, a low linear obstacle, one impassable, and one patch of difficult. Like when I'm setting up the table with my opponent, I'm trying to make sure the two hills are on opposite sides of the board. Probably the same thing with the two forests, and then trying to, within my power, um, just based on what pieces are being chosen by each player, kind of have the low linear obstacle, the difficult terrain, and the impassable sort of centralize on the board, but at least break up the two hills. Um, my army doesn't rely a lot on shooting
Hmm.
at all. Um, And any shooting I do have is very fast mobile stuff. So like I don't have cannons, I don't bring bolt throwers, I don't have big blocks of like archers or anything. So I'm not looking to get like the hills specifically for myself.
Yeah.
But I do want to prevent my opponent from getting them, especially if they have like cannons or things like that that can threaten my sort of big pieces. So I do think about that when I'm setting up the board. Um, Generally, and I think this is probably true for a huge swath of the player base, but I it's very rare that I've seen or done um, where I've picked the opposite side of the board that I'm not
Yeah, yeah.
standing on.
Fair.
So, so usually when I'm setting up the table or placing terrain with my opponent, I'm that's already kind of in my mind that well, I'm probably just gonna be where I'm standing anyway.
Hmm.
Um, I guess us gamers are getting lazy, but
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I think that's the same for a lot of people. Um, so I don't think about it that much. It's more just like, okay, do we have like avenues across the table for places to for engagements to happen? Is there good lanes to move my army? Um, and looking at, stuff like that. But really, I it's hard for me to say it because it's kind of more of like a intuition
Yeah, yeah.
just from having played a bunch of games and not just old world but miniature wargaming in general. Like that's kind of almost second nature to me now. um but it is something, I do try to think about when setting up the table. I don't know if that answers the question properly, but
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it does. And you've given me like a lot of stuff to bounce off on, and also sort of how I look at it. Yeah, I think so overall, I think terrain, like if you want to show up and have as good a game as possible, or do as well as you possibly can at an event, terrain needs to be part of your game plan. And I think like it also, how much terrain impacts like your army depends also obviously on the army you're playing, and what tools you have at your disposal. So like when I rock up to the table, there's like a sort of, I look at my army, I compare it to my opponent's army, and then I ask myself a few questions. And as far as like terrain goes, there's really two questions that are important. Is like, and they're very similar to, if you go back and listen to our deployment and list building episode, like the tactic episode that we put out. Is something I talked about a lot in terms of deployment, but it's very similar for terrain. So I asked myself the two questions: is like, a, who's going to be the aggressor? Like, am I the person, like, because I have lower mobility and lower usually offensive output, then I'm going to basically be receiving my opponent, and he's going to be able to dictate what fights where. So if I'm using my Chaos Dwarf example with the match I gave, I talked about in the sort of the introduction segment. If the opponent's Bretonians, I'm Chaos Dwarves, and he's got the Falcon Horn, like I'm not doing much moving, right? So like I'm going to be very defensive in that game, so that will impact how I look at terrain. That's the first thing. So if, for instance, we're looking at player place terrain, then I would look to take big pieces to block off charge lanes. Make it so my opponent can't swing around my army, and my more sort of defensive deployment is as easily as they want to, or even like just put it up against the end of the board and then deploy next to that to actually make it impossible to sort of go around from that side, just to basically help my position as the player who needs to receive the opponent's charge. So that's the first like big question: is who's the aggressor? And then the second big question is how much does my opponent rely on shooting, or magic missiles, or that kind of sort of power projection? And the answer is like, if for instance my opponent has a really big heavy shooting army, then I'll try to use terrain to obviously block his line of sight. I'll prioritize moving the hills out from deployment zones, just so he doesn't get a super convenient hill for like war machines and stuff. Yeah, so those are sort of like the big two questions. But like you, Andrew, I don't have like like it's not a hard and set rule of thumb of like I must do this with terrain. It's very much based on how the two armies match up. And like I said, if I'm going to be sort of the more passive player, unfortunately, or if I've got to block out some shooting or open up lanes for my own shooting, that kind of stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, does that like kind of jive with what you're thinking?
Yeah, it's basically kind of like the way I see it too. Like there's no one sort of rule that dictates how you're going to set up terrain if you're doing so based on like how the game's going to look. You know, your army, your opponent's army, like it's always going to be like a different combination of variables. Um, so yeah, like it's hard for us to like pinpoint like, oh, this is exactly how you're supposed to do that. It's
Yeah.
more, you know, what types of terrain pieces will be advantageous for you and which ones will be advantageous for your opponent, and how you kind of with terrain setup mitigate those while also you know, giving yourself a little bit of advantage.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I think yeah, I would say that like just if I was gonna make a single rule up for how terrain sort of should be used, I would say that like terrain is more often than not at like a defensive sort of item in this game because it limits mobility, it limits ability to charge, it limits ability to like do shooting through like just because you're blocking the line of sight. So as a result, you know, the sort of more defensive or the least mobile army just needs to think a lot more about terrain to sort of even out the odds there, right? So I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure that like since Ryan's not here, I'm gonna just use him as an example. But if he's bringing a big Peg Knight bus army and a bunch of knights, he's not as worried about where the forest or the field is, the cornfield is on the board as me, for instance, right? So like just yeah. So I think it's more of a defensive item, and I think that'll become terrain in general, and that'll become obvious when we get to the next part here. So let's talk about some of like the most common pieces of terrain that you'll see on your board. And like the first one, I think that shows up in a lot of games, and then like just Andrew, give me like your thoughts on that piece of terrain and how you've used it in the past, or you've seen other sort of players use it. So yeah, let's kick off with like forests, which I think are pretty common across boards.
Yeah, so forests, I mean, again, in our meta, um, they're fairly common because we usually try to have two per table. Um, Usually when I'm placing forests, I'm thinking, um, one, if I'm facing like a shooting heavy army, playing dark elves, I don't like that because I really don't have super high armor saves, and my toughness is 3 almost across the board for most of my stuff. So I'm looking to use force to block shooting lines, something I can sort of hide my army behind as I move up the board. Also, I'm looking at what kind of fast moving cav and skirmishing type stuff that my opponent might have.
Yeah.
So I might use force to anchor flanks because they won't be able to see through it, or you know, get reliable charges through it because it does slow you down, or in some cases if you're playing it as dangerous could potentially also hurt. So that makes, you know, that dictates to my opponent like, okay, they have to make a hard choice if they want to try charging through a force at my stuff, if
Yeah.
they can even see what they want to charge at anyway. um so that's kind of how I generally use forests. My army doesn't have a lot of interplay with forests, so you know, when they're on the board, they're also just as much a detriment to me as they are
Hmm.
to my opponent, unless it's like wood elves or beastmen or stuff like that,
Yeah.
who might have move through cover, or you know, be able to have all the weird wood elf buffs they get being around forests and shit.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. No, no, that makes sense. And I'm gonna touch like I think two of the big points that you talk there. Like I think again, as I mentioned earlier, forests are like a great defensive piece for the two reasons generally that you mentioned. Like the first one is I use them routinely to obviously block line of sight, or add an additional -1 to hit penalty there from shooting is like another sort of defensive against shooting use you can leverage from forests. And then I think also the like from a game tactical perspective, how I often use forests is just to limit an opponent's ability to charge because of obviously the sort of difficult terrain rules that apply to the forest in terms of they've got to pick the lowest of two dice and then they're -1 to their movement. Like that has a massive ability impact on the opponent's ability to actually pull off charges, especially like in the early turns. Like by turn, 3 or 4, certainly 5 and stuff, they'll be close enough that it won't matter. But like it can cause a lot of failed charges, especially early in the game. So I like to put cheap units in forests just to bait out bad charges that are statistically less likely to be actually pulled off. I think also having shooting units inside the forest is also especially like a good place to, like a secret tech good place to put them, because they're much harder to get to than when they're in an open field. And as we know, when your archers get charged, like bad things tend to happen. And then you can also do some like gamey stuff with forests that I've done in the past. If you have like an evasive unit, you can an evasive shooting unit, you can put it in the forest, shoot, and then when you get shot, like sort of fall back behind the forest to like no longer be in line of sight. Which is a fun little trick I've pulled off with the Hobgoblin Con with that was tossing fireballs there. Peek into the forest, shoot, and then scoot out when you get shot back. And you could also, before this has been killed in the last FAQ, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but like before, people would rotate war machines into the forest because they could free pivot and then shoot and then rotate them back out after. Unfortunately, or actually fortunately, in terms of just how gamey it is, you can no longer do that. But that was sort of another little gamey trick you could do with forest. So yeah, I think they're first of all, they look good on the board, and they're like a pretty impactful piece for sure. Okay, next one, and I can probably take it in terms of start off there. Buildings and or impassable terrain. They're usually buildings when we play. Yeah, so I think this is another pretty common and impactful piece of terrain. And I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about, how do I deploy and stuff. And I think, the main use tactically for impassable terrain is like it's a nice sort of anchor point, which prevents your opponent from like sort of wrapping around, flank charging you, all that kind of stuff. Like I really like it in that fashion. So I will often deploy next to a piece of impassable terrain or whatever, just to make it like so that my opponent has to take an extra turn or two going around, because I tend to play a slow army. Obviously, it has all the line of sight blocking benefits that you could want to. So just being behind it is also great, but it also limits your ability to charge. So it's a sort of double-edged sword for sure when it comes to buildings. But if you're playing a more defensive game, if you've got to save points or whatever, like it's an easy way to make your units very difficult to hit or shoot or whatever, is tucking them behind a piece of terrain like that. In terms of just being a little bit more gamey, I've used it before. This is like it's game state dependent, obviously, but I've had combats where I've been able to line up units that fell back in good order or whatever from a larger opponent to be sort of next to a piece of terrain, so that your longer like an opponent that has a longer rank gets caught up in the piece of terrain and can actually follow up into you. So I think you could do some pretty fun stuff like that too with buildings. But like, yeah, generally it's a nice way to prevent yourself from getting charged from angles that you don't want to, using buildings and stuff. Does that sort of like mesh with how you see buildings and impassable terrain, Andrew?
Yeah, that's generally how I use them. Also, if if they're in your like an area where in your deployment zone maybe or something, if there is a piece that you're worried about, being cannonballed or being picked off
Yeah,
from range, you can always use them to hide, something as well. Um, I know, like in the past, I've kind of hid like my dragon behind line of sight blocking impossible for a few turns while I sent like my dark riders up to deal with war machines and things that would have
yeah,
threatened it. But that's again kind of game dependent, board state dependent. Again, like a lot of the tactics we're probably going to talk about are very much like in the moment decisions you have to make based on the game state.
yeah,
Um, so again, it's really hard to be like, oh, here's the exact way you should be using these types of terrain pieces. Um, but yeah, like generally the things you highlighted is kind of how I use line of sight as well. Line of sight
Yep, and
blocking.
you Yeah, you're right. Like, and I didn't call it out specifically, but like, if you've got to hide from cannons, you're entirely correct. Like, buildings are impassable terrain, except no substitute. Like
Yeah.
just tuck right in there and just find a way to deal with it or whatever. Okay, the next one, Andrew, is difficult or dangerous terrain patches. Stuff like is usually modeled like lakes or marshes or I don't know, swamps, cornfields, what have you. Just like regular dangerous or dangerous terrain patches.
Yeah, these are cool. Um, I really like them in terms of, so like in my games, if there's one there again, something I can anchor a flank around. Um, One of the big things with like these types of difficult and dangerous terrain patches is it reduces your movement by one,
Yep.
which also affects things like charging. And it also makes you drop a dice when or you pick the lowest die when you roll.
Yeah. Yes, that's
Is that
correct.
correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, if there's a unit that you're trying to get some board control with, but also keep safe. Like this is a good way to sort of hide them behind it,
Yep.
especially if you have ways to ignore said piece of terrain. So, if you're using travel missile pathways or something, you could bunker up, um, that unit you're trying to keep alive behind a difficult terrain piece for a turn. And
Yep.
generally, your opponent's going to have a hard time getting to it. And then following turn, you zap out of there, or any of the other like crazy movement shenanigan um, spells that exist. Like this is a good piece to use defensively to keep you safe for a turn. Um, Often we use um, we have them as dangerous terrain, I believe, a lot of the time. So that's pretty bad for cav and chariots. So it can
Yep.
be something to use to kind of keep those types of units at bay while you're trying to deal with other things on the board. Um, So yeah, that's kind of the general way I use them. I think this probably out of all the things we speak about is the one that has the least sort of impact on the overall game. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't block line of sight to anything. Yeah,
It's just
so
the movement penalties. Yeah.
it's just the movement penalty. So you can play around with that there, but I think this is sort of the most benign of the terrain pieces.
Yeah, this or the next one for sure, the low linear obstacles.
Yeah.
But yeah, but this one though, like just a little bit of added stuff in terms of dangerous and difficult patches. So again, you mentioned it, Andrew. It's definitely another defensive terrain piece. And I think it sort of lets you, let's call it like soft zone out parts of the board. And what I mean by that is, you talked about a bunkering behind or right up next to a piece of terrain of dangerous or difficult terrain to again like limit your opponent's ability to charge you significantly. I think is the main use for these. And then that like the just on the board, it depends on what's charging you, how you sort of orient yourself around that piece of terrain, right? So if your opponent has fly, for instance, you want to make sure that you're tucked up exactly like right up or as close to or quite close to the piece of dangerous or difficult terrain, just so that there's no way that they can fly over it and fit in. Obvious, like a lot of this is obvious stuff there, but so they can't just fit in and charge you through it. And then if your opponent is sort of on the ground, like cavalry or what have you, then you have definitely the ability to sort of pull back from it a little bit more to give yourself some options after. But like I really like those pieces of terrain because A, they don't block line of sight, and B, like I said, they let you again sort of zone out parts of the board for charges or make charges much more difficult. And then the only thing I'll say for like dangerous terrain is I don't often sort of factor in the dangerous terrain rolls too much, like because it's a 1 out of 6, and and then it depends on what the unit is like and stuff. But like, don't underestimate it because it can lead to some pretty Warhammery stuff if it starts to spike on you or on your opponent. Your your expensive cav, a 1 wound cav, is like in a is in a really bad spot if it rolls 2 or 3 dangerous terrain test rolls as a 1 there, and you lose some super expensive models. My last game that I played, I actually had my wyvern die on a piece of dangerous terrain. Yeah, so it can also have an impact. Like, yeah, it was, the game was lost. I said, fuck it, and it's like a 1 out of 6 chance, and he did actually bite it from actually moving over a vortex on the ground because of the Falconhorn. But anyways, so like they're also impacted. Okay, next one. Low linear obstacles. Like, how have you seen those used, or how have you used them?
Probably not. I haven't seen them used in the way that the probably developers had hoped. People bunkering big blocks of infantry behind them to, lock down a flank or something on the board.
Yeah,
Um, Maybe we'll see that change though, given that there's objectives and stuff now placed on the table. So people might be placing those in a way that will give them a significant buff if they're trying to, sit on top of an objective. They might
yeah,
have one, a couple inches away or something. Um, but generally, no, like again, the only real use I use these for when they're on the table is to try to mitigate, impacts from chariots and stuff because they are dangerous terrain for chariots.
yeah,
So I'll try to skirt around them if that's a worry. Again, they do slow down movement. Um, but generally, like I don't use them actively. They're more of like a passive thing on the table that I've kind of um, used to zone out potential charges as I'm moving around.
yeah.
But again, this one's kind of out of all the ones we're gonna talk about. This is the one that kind of comes up the least in my games.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, I haven't seen this one come up a ton. Um, and I think it's because it's not massively impactful, because usually they're pretty small pieces of terrain. Like, I haven't seen any boards with a low linear obstacle covering half the board or whatever, or like bisecting the board or anything silly. Like, they tend to be quite small, so their impact is more limited. They don't block line of sight, obviously, or anything like that. Um, and we just don't tend to play with a ton of them here. But like, there's a few things. So I think infantry benefits the most from these kind of from this kind of terrain, in terms of just it's not garrisoning it, but like protecting it, or whatever the game rules term is, just tucking up right next to it there and being charged from the other side. And as we see more infantry and as we see more objective play, so static infantry, perhaps low linear obstacles sort of have more value to prevent impact hits and that kind of stuff from targeting your infantry. Um, the only way that I've sort of seen them used, I think, in an effective manner before, is just as like an annoying movement impediment. So like, I've had a few games where my opponent has placed like the silly little low linear obstacle right in the middle of like an open lane between terrain, and then when you've got to like move a significant portion of your army through that point, and it happens to become difficult terrain when you move over it or whatever, it really slows down your movement, and it can really sort of be an annoying one, especially if it's like in your charge lanes and stuff. So yeah, definitely you can think of it as like just an annoying little speed bump that your opponent needs to maneuver around. And if you place your army decently far enough behind that like it really becomes a pain to charge through it, I think it can also be useful in that way. So, but yeah, it is the least impactful one. Speaking of low impact to potentially high impact, hills. What are your thoughts on these on this one, Andrew?
So this one probably has the biggest impact on how the game plays, just how your units interact with hills. Again, I think that's army dependent though. Like for me,
Yep.
hills are kind of a nothing because I don't have a lot of range shooting. But they're definitely really great pieces if you have a lot of like war machines because you get basically a limited line of sight to the board. Um, with a few caveats there.
Yep.
Also, if you have sort of infantry level shooting, range attacks, you do get to fire in a second rank when on a hill. So that's a huge, you're basically doubling your damage output from ranged units. Um, so just those in general, especially if your armies lean heavily into, ranged attacks, like hills are such a key piece to that equation because it just allows you to either operate more effectively or, get more damage output from those units you bring. Um, so I think that's, yeah, like I think I've covered most of that. Again, just outside of range, being able to use them to block line of sight. You can hide pieces behind them if you want because they do block vision to things that are behind a hill.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it as well. But yeah, generally, like the way I see it used most is for ranged armies as some sort of like bunker to place a lot of
Yeah.
their big heavy pieces on.
Yeah, no, you've hit the most important points here, I think. I think it's probably the only sort of terrain item that has both an offensive and a defensive role. Generally, it's mainly just defensive, as I've talked about. But so offensively, for sure, you mentioned it, and I think everybody out there knows it. Like shooting armies, love hills, especially war machine centric shooting. It's really it is a massive boon for them because of that line of sight drawing ability. However, just be careful at home if you tuck up all your war machines on a hill. Like it can become a bit of a trap in the sense that if your opponent has some fast movers, things that can get to the hill pretty quickly and move around your line. Then like I've seen it quite often where you charge a war machine, overrun into another war machine, and overrun into another one, and just sort of pick up the whole line like that. So consider spreading them out, and then if you must put them all on the hill for whatever reason, then I really recommend like trying to go at least for like a sort of checkerboard pattern for how you deploy them, so that at least like it makes it harder to overrun from one war machine into the next. So yeah, so it's happened to me. It's happened to people I've played against. So just something to for sure keep in mind. And then from a defensive perspective for hills, I think one thing you didn't mention, Andrew, that came out in not this fact, but the one before, is hills are actually a great defensive piece for especially when you're facing cannons, because cannons cannot bounce their shots onto the hill. Like the classic 10 from the back thing doesn't work because the moment the cannonball touches the hill, it's like it stops and it doesn't do
Yep.
anything anymore. So they need to like fucking bullseye the target on the hill there, which is actually a lot more difficult than it sounds, especially if it's a smaller base. So yeah, they're great defense against hills. So if you're if you have an army that you don't typically deploy on hills, but your opponent has cannons, like it can often, and the hill is well located, it can often be like a pretty smart move to turn one, deploy your stuff on or in deployment phase, put like high value items on the hill, just so that they can't effectively be shot if your opponent does get the first turn, and you could close that gap. Like obviously it's like board dependent and stuff, but like it is
Yep.
something I've used them for. And then the last thing I'll say is like don't neglect sort of a hill in the middle of the board. Also, like it does have some great defensive value, as Andrew mentioned, in terms of being line of sight blocking. I think hills are the only piece of terrain that is line of sight blocking, but not movement limiting. Like it limits your ability to declare charges, of course. But like it does, like you could just walk over it because it counts as open terrain. So there is some definite value in that. If you've got a fast moving cav army or whatever, and your opponent has some decent shooting, or even if he doesn't have, even if he just has like some shooting, tossing a hill if your player plays terrain there in the middle of the board to sort of move up behind and use as cover until you're in charge, declarable charge range, I think is also like a nice effective strategy. Um, yeah, I think that covers hills. Is there anything I forgot, Andrew, in terms of like different pieces or types of terrain, or like you anything specific for other stuff you want to talk about, like terrain wise?
No, like I guess we could go into like the specialty terrain pieces, but generally they are just a different version of one of the
Yeah,
archetypes we talked about with a few extra rules tacked on top. Um,
yeah,
so I don't think there's anything like
yeah,
significantly different about them. Some of them will give you like a bonus to cast or like magic resistance. Like there's nothing crazy. And for the most part, I find, at least in our tournament scene, we don't use them too much, other than sometimes for King of the Hill, we make it the arcane monolith or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that the
Yeah,
one we use?
exactly. Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. Like that's why I left them out originally. They don't pop up super often, and they kind of fit in with the other ones. So, okay, last one before we move on to sort of more hobbying aspects of terrain. Like Andrew, has your sort of thinking about terrain changed at all based on the new mission pack that's come out in the match play guide or the FAQ, or do you think like everything we said fit before and it fits now still?
I think I think it will change the impact terrain has on the game if you're using those missions from the match play. There's a lot of stuff there where it's like you need to either control an objective piece, or keeping your baggage train safe. Even if you're doing like the table quarters one, if you're able to use terrain to block your opponent from easily getting to certain table
Yeah,
quarters, I think those are going to be pretty significant on how, like, the flow of how that game goes, if you're placing them properly to your advantage. Or on the flip side, if your opponent does the same, you might have a harder time scoring those objectives or getting to that said baggage train. So I think, yeah, like, definitely, just given that there's more onus on things on the table that aren't your army in
yeah.
as a, like, a mode to get points and win your games. I think definitely terrain is going to have a more significant impact on those games.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it does like increase the impact of terrain a fair amount because I think the game is becoming a little bit more static in the sense that there's more things that are going to be in fixed locations for multiple turns, either because they're holding a strategic location, they need to be parked on the King of the hill in the King of the Hill, or like it's a baggage train that needs to be controlled for multiple turns. So I think as a result of that, how you place your terrain around those things, because obviously you can't put terrain over an objective or strategic location or whatever, like how you place terrain around that to limit your opponent's access, because you generally know from which direction they'll be coming. Like it's one of two choices in most cases, except for one mission. So yeah, I think it does improve, as you said, it increase the value of how you especially place terrain and how you see terrain. Like I think if you're going to do, for instance, if you know the mission has the baggage train, then like putting a piece of terrain not far off from where you plan to deploy your baggage train, so that you could sort of hide off a complete side of it or whatever, I think is definitely an effective strategy. And the same goes to be said for like the other, even if it's like the other missions, even if it's like strategic locations, putting a piece of terrain sort of where your opponent will be coming from to make it harder for them to get to that strategic objective, I think all becomes a valid. Those things all become valid plays. So yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. Like the impact of terrain, I think has grown because the game is going to be a little bit more static than it was before. Okay, let's talk about acquiring and hobbying up some terrain. So, yeah, this is a gimme for you, Andrew. Like, how do you feel about hobbying up terrain in general? Like, is it a part of the hobby you enjoy at all, or not?
It is the main part of the hobby that I enjoy. Um,
Okay.
I really hate painting miniatures. I hate building miniatures. Um, I just find it really tedious. And I like to think that after 20 years or whatever I've been in this hobby, that I'm a fairly decent painter. Um, but I still hate doing it. But just for me, like, making terrain and making cool pieces and kind of using terrain as, like, almost like a storytelling element while you're doing it, like, it's just a really fun creative outlet for me. Because I like to do different things, or even like now that I've kind of turned towards 3D printing and stuff like that,
Yeah.
just finding cool pieces that it's like, oh, this this forest looks really cool, and it'd pair really well with this building from another creator. So I get those and print them and kind of paint them in a way that they become like a terrain set. Like I really enjoy that whole, I guess, creative outlet of the hobby as opposed to building miniatures, especially newer GW designs where they seem a little bit over engineered.
Yeah,
um
like 35 pieces on the model. Yeah.
well, yeah, like the one you're seeing now is like, I guess, the legs on the cafe sentinel is a bit of a nightmare for some people.
Yeah.
So just like stuff like that, like I don't get that much enjoyment out of, but like actually building pieces of terrain and the satisfaction of finishing a piece and seeing it on the table and having myself and my opponent interact with that, like that's so fun to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. What do you think about building terrain and that
Um
aspect of things?
yeah, like I enjoy it less than you, but that's not to say that I hate it. Like I really I enjoy painting miniatures, like the figures themselves. Like I don't hate painting terrain. I just, to me, it often feels like it gets in the way of painting armies, painting models, because like I just have a finite amount of time to hobby, and if I'm painting up a table's worth of terrain, like I'm not painting up 2 units or what have you, right? So
Yeah.
that's always sort of the dilemma I have with painting terrain, and I think for that reason, I've often like bought painted terrain as a result. Like I've painted some up too, obviously, like some. But you're right, like it does make for a really cool set. Like I remember when I first painted up that big the first Warcry set that came up with all like these ruined like
Yeah.
gladiator type buildings and barricades and stuff, like I and like broken statues and everything, like that looks super great, and I've used it like a ton of times in different game systems. So like yeah, I enjoy it. It's just I always have the dilemma of like, while I'm painting terrain, I'm not doing something else.
Yeah,
um
I
yeah.
can see that.
Okay, first things first. Let's start with, if we have a listener, Andrew, who's just wants to get a table furnished for their house or whatever. They want to update their scenery, or maybe they're just getting like their first table's worth of terrain up and running. Like, what sort of strategies would you propose to that person, or tips? Like, would you, and how would you approach that? Like, would you recommend hobbying it up yourself or buying it, or like what would you look at?
I mean, really depends on sort of what your budget is.
Yeah,
There is a lot of, very nice pre-done, pre-painted pieces. Gale Force Nine's line of terrain comes to mind off the top of my head. Those are very nice, robust pieces that just, you open the box, pull it out, and you're good to go right away. Um, there's a huge now market for 3D printing, and even if you don't want to jump into the manufacturing side of that, there's enough people who will 3D print things for you for, a fee. So that's
yeah,
a good way to get terrain quickly. Um, those do kind of generally get a little bit expensive, especially if you're trying to furnish a whole table. Um, so it really, again, depends on your budget. Um, but you can, make some fairly decent pieces pretty cheaply. One of the biggest, I guess, materials that everyone uses is cardboard, and it's super abundant. You buy a box off of Amazon or something cool, you now have building materials you can make, a small fantasy style building out of, very simple, sort of like a birdhouse design, right? And it's very easy to just slap that together with some glue, paint it up, dress it up with popsicle sticks. Like I've made pieces like that before. I still
yeah,
have some that we use. It's very simple and cheap materials. It does take a little bit more time and effort to make the piece, but like it doesn't have to be amazingly beautiful. For me, like when I paint terrain, um, I don't put as much effort into painting a terrain piece as I do like a single miniature. Usually if you get like the broad strokes done, you block out some colors and pick out one or two details, like that's good enough for a table because the focus isn't the terrain, it's your armies on the table. So you can kind of get away with not going super crazy
yeah.
on the terrain. I have done so, but that's just because I'm a little bit
You like
crazy.
it?
But
Yeah, yeah.
like I like it. Like that's what I like doing, but like you don't have to, and you're still gonna have a nice looking table if you don't.
Yeah.
But even, the classic, how do I make a hill? Well, you put some books under a blanket or like your gaming mat, and there you go. You got a hill super easy. Like,
Yeah.
you can get into this very easy and cheaply and still get a good um,
Good experience out of it.
outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. But like, you can also go the other direction and go like super in depth and buy and build and
Yeah.
model
Yeah.
crazy stuff. So it's kind of just like how deep you want to go into it, and again, kind of what your budget is.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed with all of that. I think sort of if you're doing a single terrain, single table for your house is kind of the time that I would recommend, or at least that I would be open to actually just buying terrain, like, and not dealing with the fuss and getting it out of the way. I'm convinced, and I have, in fact, you can get a, like, again, it's budget dependent, but a nice table with a mat furnished for $200-300, which I think is sort of, it works well for a table, and obviously that doesn't scale up, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes here. But like, got to do multiple tables, you can't, because it'll be like prohibitively expensive very quickly. And for the same reason, because you're just doing a table, like, don't get into 3D printed terrain for a table at your house. Like, it needs to be more of a slightly bigger scale for that to sort of make sense. And what I would sort of recommend is, if you do end up buying, like, just from a look and feel stuff, again, always budget dependent, but like, I find that MDF terrain looks a little bit cheap. So like, I don't like the look and feel of it, so I've sort of gravitated more towards like painted resin terrain, and there's like a few options out there. Like, I've picked up terrain from, and not sponsored by any of those, although if they wish they could call us, but gamemat.eu has some, if you're, especially if you're on like the European side of the lake, like, there's some really nice pre-painted resin, like chunky terrain that's cheaper than GW terrain that you need to build and paint. Out of that, it's a bit less fantasy specific, but they do have some for sure. Battlefield in a Box is another sort of staple. Like, if you need a forest, you'll get a forest, you'll get a lake out of them, you'll get a hill out of them. Like, I think they're pretty generally, I think, good value for what you get. It comes painted, and it's like a good solid resin quality, so I like that. FLG, like Frontline Gaming, for mats is something I've used in the past. Also, like gaming mats, I would recommend getting one of those. They're pretty cheap, and I think they add a lot of visual interest to your game. You could get like as crazy as you want with the mat. Like, there's, you know, uh, snow over a lava field, and there's like that level of crazy, all the way down to like just a green open grass field. So like, there's plenty of options and sizes. So that's definitely an option too. And then, yeah, I think the one I would recommend the least is like going the GW route and buying their terrain, because that it's more expensive than getting something paint that like comes painted and built. It takes more time and stuff. And then, if you're going to compare it to actually hobbying it up, like Andrew was saying, and building your own, like from scratch, building your terrain, like it's like, it just sort of falls, you get the advantages of neither and the disadvantages of both, and that, like, it takes you a lot of time and it's super expensive. So I'm not a huge fan, unless there's like a really key piece of, like, I bought, for instance, the how's that kit called? Like the manor, like the old world manor
Fortified
from the
Manor.
Empire. Yeah, the fortified manor, just because it's a nice kit, like, and to have, and it's iconic and stuff. But I wouldn't recommend going down that road for like your first table or whatever. So, yeah. And then the last thing I'll say before we move on, because we'll talk about hobbying specifically later for terrain, but I think I do like, when it comes to like painting terrain, Andrew, a bit like you, that like, it's a bunch of different techniques that you can get, that you can use to paint terrain that you don't use on your miniatures. Like, a lot more sponging, a lot more like, very, like, you could be really gross with how you apply your paint, like just toss it all over the place, and like, it works well for that kind of painting. And it's like, it feels good to just slap dash it and be pretty random and stuff, and get a really good looking result at the end of the day. Like, there's something to that for sure. So anyways, we'll talk about it later. um Okay, so we talked about getting a table, Andrew. How do you think things change if you're if you're going to be running local events or whatever, and you've got to step up and build or provide terrain for 6, 10, 24 potentially tables, etc., for an event, like, is buying still an option? Would you recommend 3D printing, or like, how do you see that?
I mean, if you're rich, you can start buying, but um, like you said, one table with mat is anywhere from 250 to 300 depending on what the kits are, and it can even
Yeah.
go up from there depending
Yep.
on if you're buying like really nice pieces or whatnot. So if you're, multiplying that by 10 tables already, you're talking about dropping close to 3 grand, if not
Yeah.
more. So again, if you have that kind of money, like, all the to you. Um, Really though, I would probably suggest starting to manufacture your own, or, consider um, picking up a 3D printer. Again, that's a big expenditure out the gate, but it will save you money in the long run when you're manufacturing, full tables worth of terrain. Um, and you can get it done fairly quickly, or you can paint up pieces as other ones are printing, so you kind of have like a constant workflow. um so I think that's probably the route that's easiest if you're, starting out in, event running and stuff like that. I think 3D printing is probably the way of the future, especially with how good these machines are now, like, for a decent price. um so I think, yeah, that's probably the best. I went a different route because I only got the 3D printer a few months ago. So, like, a lot of my pieces are very much handmade, and just stuff I've collected over the past 12 years, 13 years of doing events and terrain. And we started small, with only a few tables, and then built up from there. Um, but it's really just what kind of workload you're able to take on as well.
Yeah, and that is definitely something to think about. Like, before I go in terms of workload, Andrew, like, with your system that you've got, just to give people an idea at home, like, how many hours do you think it takes you to get a single table up and running?
Uh, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15
Yeah,
per
yeah,
table.
yeah. So that
Um,
is definitely something to think about. Yeah,
yeah, so, like, I I actually have, I call it like seasons now. So, um around May. So our main Warhammer event is Capital City Bloodbath. We run it every August. Usually around May, I stop any other hobby. So, like, I won't work on miniatures, I won't paint up armies. Like, I just focus on building terrain for that event. And basically all my hobby time that I have, in those 3 or 4 months leading up to Capital City Bloodbath, I spend solely on just terrain projects, updating tables, making new tables, things like that. So, it is a lot of work. And even like going into this one, for this year, like, I'm only making 5 tables for Capital City Bloodbath, the old
yeah.
world, but I'm also building um, a team tournaments a 40K team tournaments pod worth of WTC style ruins. So that's like
Okay.
8 tables worth of 40K terrain. Um, Again, 3D printed because it'll be easy.
Yeah,
It's more just the time expenditure of the machine, and then I just paint those up right quick. So it is a lot of work to
yeah,
get to that point, but also, um, let's say this year I stop making terrain, like, I'm good for years, right? I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
think, I'm, you know, when I do these 5 tables, I'll have enough for 50-player events, unless we see like a huge jump in sort of the community here for Old World. I think that's going to do us pretty good for at least the next, 3 to 4 years, maybe even
agreed.
more. So I don't think I'm going to have to go this hard in the future. Um, but it was a lot to sort of get to this point every year, updating the tables. So again, like, I think, if you are a new TO looking to run, local events, maybe just focus on 3 or 4 tables. That's still a decent, 6 to 8 player event. And then, over the course of the year, you start adding tables slowly and then keep growing your event as, people get more interest in it or whatnot. The other option, and this is a big one, especially for new TOs, is approach your local RTT or Rogue Trader stores or whatever, RTSs, um, and just see if they have terrain available to supplement what you have. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, I want to run an event at your store. I see you have some terrain, so can I use that for my tournament? And then you don't have as much terrain to supply you don't need as much terrain to supply
Yeah.
yourself. Um, Also, if there are other event organizers or clubs in your city, again, reach out to them and say like, hey, I'm looking to run an event. Is there a way I can borrow terrain? A
Yeah.
lot of those clubs and stuff are more than willing to loan those things out. Um, because they want to grow the community as well. And more players at one event means potentially more players at their club in the
Yeah.
future. So, you know, be respectful, obviously. Like, don't demand that, like, hey, you have to give me the train. But, like, if you approach them nicely and, like, just explain your situation, and I think you'll find that there's a lot of other more established groups that are more than willing to help out other
Yeah.
people do events.
Yeah, no, that's that all makes sense, and that's one thing I was going to touch on is asking hobby shops that because oftentimes they'll have like your local gaming store will have like a significant pile of terrain already there that you could leverage. But yeah, getting back to like the sort of the question at hand here, I agree with you, Andrew, in that like I don't think buying up like pieces of painted terrain, pre-painted terrain scales up well or at all for when you're starting to sort of dip your toes into running events. It's going to get extremely expensive, but I think most importantly, just because of how tournaments work and how ticket prices work out and expenses and stuff like that, like it's going to take you forever to reimburse the cost, and then that you're essentially sort of um, buying up for the community's benefit there. And like, there's always going to be costs. That's fine, but if you're dropping, you're furnishing 10 tables at $300 each with pre-painted terrain, like dropping that $3,000 or whatever, like it's going to take you forever to get that money back. So I like strongly would not recommend buying up in that context. And I think like 100%, if you're doing a significant amount of tables, 3D printing is the name of the game. Just in terms of reducing your cost and having like a steady supply, like just it. I think it fits well in terms of workflow management. Like stuff keeps coming out. You're not waiting at like there's not a lot of wasted time if you're using that system too. So yeah, I would push people towards 3D printing if that's the situation they're in. And then I'll say like on top of your hobby shops, if you are looking for terrain, as Andrew has said, like reaching out to groups and stuff, but also like you can crowdsource it with individuals. Like chances are you will know a lot of people who are showing up to your event, especially if you're starting to run them and stuff, and then asking them, the first few times while you get your own stuff going, if they can bring their mat and their pieces of terrain is not a bad way to get started too. So there's that too. Um,
Yeah, just
since we've
touching
both,
on
yeah,
that,
yeah,
that's actually there's a lot of events out there that run it. So it's like, okay, you sign up for the event, you bring your army, but you also are expected to bring a table.
okay,
Not so much in our scene here, but I know like I think that's fairly commonplace in like the Marvel Crisis Protocol scene.
okay,
People like you bring your table setup or like half a terrain setup on top of like whatever your faction is. So like you can probably set up old world events in the same way. It's like, okay,
yeah,
um you bring your army but also bring, 3 pieces of terrain, and you just kind of you and your opponent bring those across your tables as you play.
yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
have
and
a
I will,
rule like they have to be 3 different types, but
yeah. Yeah, and I
or
guarantee that at least like half the players at your unit at your event have terrain at home, so like, they can definitely pitch in. Yeah, what were you trying to say there?
no, that was it.
Okay, so we've both mentioned Andrew 3D printing. Like you know this aspect of the hobby like a million times better than me. Like, do you have any big pointers for people who are looking at getting started in terms of 3D printing for terrain specifically? Like, where you get your STLs from, or like any sort of big pointers that you have?
Um, I would say for one, set a budget and stay within it. There's so many like STLs and things like that out there, and it's very easy to go because they're all like, $5 to $20 for a piece to download one of these STLs if you're buying them. There's a lot of free options out there too. But if you're buying them, it's very easy to start just grabbing every STL you see, and then um, you realize you've spent like a ridiculous amount of money on just files, not even including like the cost of filament and stuff to print it. So just kind of like be cognizant of that. And also, if you are trying to kit out like a full event, don't spend your money on STLs that are sort of single use, like unique pieces. So, if you find like a good forest set that can be printed multiple times across a bunch of different tables, like that's better than buying, six different tree sets. Find
Yeah,
something
yeah,
that you like that you're not just, the whole benefit of 3D printing is that once you buy that file, you can make that piece multiple times. So it really kind of defeats the purpose if you're just buying STL for like a single use, unless you super want that piece for whatever reason.
yeah.
But I think you should be thinking about that. Now, in terms of where to get those types of files, there's a few sort of main sites. So one of them is called 3D. Just Google it. I don't know the actual address.
Okay.
Um, so that that one kind of is a more general STL site, so they have kind of everything, even stuff that's like outside of the scope of miniature wargaming. But there is a huge scene there for miniature wargaming. There's a lot of really good files there, and they have a search option, so you just write like, I don't know, let's say miniature fantasy buildings, and then it'll bring up everything, and you can just kind of scroll through and look. Um, those are really good. And again, there's a lot of free options as well. People will put up like samples of their work, so you download that and you can print it and see how like nice the terrain piece is, and then you can maybe go buy some of their other files. Some of them are independent creators too, so they're not in it to get money. They're just making cool pieces for people to enjoy. So there is a lot of options there. The other big one is My Mini Factory. Again, you can Google it. That one is definitely um, like miniatures focused, that site. Um, both, you know, basically anything you can think of miniature gaming wise is on there. Miniatures themselves, like actual, units and stuff for your game. But there's a huge terrain scene there as well. So those are kind of like my two go-tos. There's a few like other kind of one-off sites, but they're not as good, I find, as Cults 3D and My Mini Factory.
Awesome. No, that's super super helpful. Okay, let's go back to basics for a second, and let's say you're going to be scratch building your terrain, whether it's hills, forests, what have you. Like, do you have any tools or tips that you'd recommend, Andrew, as somebody who's built a ton of terrain, for people to sort of make sure that they get their hands on?
Um, for me, the go-to is pink insulation foam.
Yeah,
Um, you can buy, at least in Canada, I realize depending on like your climate and stuff, the prices might vary. But for us in Canada, where we live, it's a fairly common like building material, so you can get it at places like Home Depot or any sort of like, you know,
hardware store. Yeah,
hardware store. That's the word I'm looking for.
yeah.
And at least here, like you get them in sheets of like 8 feet by 2 feet
Hmm.
or 8 feet by 4 feet, and like the one I get is inch and a half thick,
Yeah.
and it's like $30 for a huge sheet that you can cut up with um, just like a really sharp box cutter
Mhm.
or a knife. Um, Again, I've been doing this a long time and I do it very often, so I've bought also hot wire cutters to use on the foam. And then it's very easy to either with a knife or with a hot wire cutter shape that piece into a hill shape. You can bevel the edges. Um, One technique I learned just off a YouTube video was to score the edges of it and then scrape it with a very hard um, piece of metal or piece of wood, and it'll break up the foam where you scored it to make it look like a rock face. So that's a
Nice.
technique I use very much. And then paint's very easy. You can dry brush it, and then yeah, basically you got a hill right there. And then whatever sort of dressing you want to put on top, if you use flocks or I bought a big tub of sandbox sand, so I use that for a lot of my terrain pieces just to make it look like earth. Um, but that's probably the easiest way to make hills, unless you go like the route of cardboard, and you can stack up like 5 or 6 pieces of cardboard, cut it into shape of whatever hill shape you want, and then cover the edges with masking tape, and they can flock the whole piece.
Mhm.
You can do that super cheap, like $5 worth of materials, if that. And you still get a hill either way. But my go-to is definitely pink foam. Just it's cheap, it's light, and you can kind of do whatever you want with it. It's
Yeah.
just like a marble that you break apart or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Leonardo da Vinci style.
I've definitely used pink insulation foam too for like building like random staircases, like just cutting out little stairs and making staircases that way, or making like bricks out of it, or like anything, right? It's super easy to build with, so that's like that is definitely a good one. um I've used it mainly for basing rather than like basing supplies and putting stuff on
Yeah.
bases rather than building pieces of terrain, but like it would work just as well, right? um the other thing that I would point out, like this is more Andrew's area of expertise than mine, but like one thing I have found and have used in the past to be like a good way to save money and get the kinds of quantities that you need for terrain building is model train supplies, or that kind of material used for like just general modeling, not wargaming specifically. If you happen to have one of those generalist sort of hobby shops in your town, something that's like sells usually like RC planes and trains and remote control trains, all that kind of stuff. Like they tend to have just big buckets of or big containers of flock and like tiny trees or tiny bushes material that you can all sort of use really well, or like a bunch of sand and rock that you'd use to build displays that you can use in to build to build like wargaming terrain pieces with. Like in particular, I found like the big buckets of flock to be super cheap and like yeah, cheap and have a good quantity for terrain usage. So that's all good. The only thing I would warn against is I've purchased like modeling trees for like train stands and stuff in the past, and they're I think more intended to be looked at rather than played with. So they tend to fall apart, and you get a bunch of little leaves everywhere, or little foam or whatever the hell they make their leaves and foliage out of all over the place. So there's definitely that to think about. But yeah, I wouldn't go to, if I was scratch building, I do what Andrew is suggesting, and I wouldn't go towards specific miniature wargaming items, and I would go more general to keep my costs down, and like general building supplies to keep my costs down. So yeah, cool.
Yeah,
Uh,
just keying
yeah,
off
go ahead.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
That is like you said, like model railroad stuff. Is such a great resource for just general building materials. And one of the main reasons I find for that is they don't have sort of that miniature wargaming tax.
Yeah.
So, most of these miniature wargaming companies do offer like their own flocks, but you get a very small amount for like a lot of money.
Hmm.
Whereas the exact same product from, a model train company you get like a huge tub of it for almost the same price, and it's the exact same product. It's
Yeah,
just a lot of these companies do mark up because it's like, well, war gamers might not be engaged enough to look elsewhere for these products, so they can charge a premium for it.
yeah,
The other thing is those trees, while delicate, there are ways to um, harden up the foliage so they don't fall
sure.
off. So you just mix like white glue and water together and put them in sort of a spray bottle, and you just spray the shit out of the leaves. And it will dry super hard and it'll keep it from falling.
Oh, I think you cut off there, Andrew. Falling. You were saying falling off.
Oh yeah, that was it. Just
Okay.
let it dry after you like basically just soak it in the white glue and water, and it becomes like rock hard, and all the leaves won't fall off anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of that, like that flock that comes in massive tubs, like just a quick little hobby hack if you're trying to if you're trying to do like a winter or icy basing scheme. Like I purchased from the train model supplies like a massive tub of like snow flock, like it's just white flock basically. You mix that with PVA glue, a lot of PVA glue, and it becomes like basically your Valhalla Blizzard or whatever GW sells for like pennies on the dollar in terms of price comparison. Like that tub of flock that I bought, I think I have enough white flock for like 8 lifetimes, basically. So yeah, just a quick one like that. Cool. So the last thing we've got to cover, Andrew, is if you're going to be painting up terrain, like any sort of tips on that. Like what tips would you use? Like what if you don't have an airbrush? I think it's going to come up to speed up the process. Yeah, do you want to kick off first here?
Yeah, so for me, it's keep it cheap. So here in Canada, there's a store called Dollarama. They sell these cheap, shitty acrylic poster paints for like $2 a big bottle. Actually, I'm looking at one right now. So they're 118 milliliters for a bottle of this paint. Um, Usually it's not great. It's not good for miniature war painting at all. It dries really thick, but you can get a lot of it cheap. And as long as you have like a good undercoat, so you know you still need to spray prime like whatever piece you're working on. But this stuff dry brushes fairly well. You can get a lot of pieces done from like a single bottle. Definitely don't use your actual miniature paints because, again, they're wicked expensive and they're very small, so you're going to go through them very quickly. If you don't have an airbrush, that would be my suggestion. If you do have an airbrush, go that route. It just makes everything quicker.
Yeah.
You can block in colors a lot faster. Um, so yeah, airbrush is definitely like my go-to now for a lot of stuff, and then maybe I'll, pick out a few details with a regular brush, but definitely don't use your actual like miniatures paints for that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I would say for sure, like do it with an airbrush if you have one. It'll obviously save a shit ton of time. Um, if you're not going to, because that's like the obvious answer, I would say like think big, like a big brushes. Use sponges, like big sponges to do a lot of coverage at once. Yeah, do like dry brush for sure. Instead of like doing any other kind of highlighting when you're talking about terrain, you can be really. I think you should in fact be pretty slapdash with how you apply your paint when it comes to terrain. Like don't think about it too much or too carefully. Rocks and nature are like and forests and trees and all that kind of stuff. Like they're very organic patterns. So having the 3 or 4 colors that you're going to be using laid out on your palette, and then just getting in the zone and starting to slap it on in various places and ways and methods without thinking too much is actually going to probably give you a better result even when it comes to terrain than like being extremely careful and like edge highlighting a building or what have you. Like I don't think that's worth your time and effort, and probably you won't like the result as much either. So yeah, I'd say think big, like move quickly, and just have fun with it. It's a bit of a liberating experience for sure to paint in that manner. Completely different than how, anyways, I paint miniatures. So, um, Okay, cool. So we are generally done with this. Anything else terrain wise you want to cover, Andrew, before we sign off here?
Yeah, I think just if you are looking to get into terrain making, do a lot of research. Like there's so many good resources online, either, Facebook groups, a countless number of people on YouTube who have channels dedicated just to making wargaming terrain, and they'll
Yeah,
teach you all these really great techniques or things you might not even have thought of when doing it. And those people do range the gamut of like, okay, um, fuck, I wish I could think of his name, but like his stuff focuses more on doing things cheaply with things you'll find around the house, like a lot of cardboard pieces, how to paint things nicely, um, on the cheap. And those guys also range from like, here's how you make a tree from wire and build it
yeah,
like basically from nothing. So like there's so many good resources out there, and you'll get so many great little tips and tricks even if you aren't going like the full on manufacturing, even just making simple pieces. Like just do your research. There, yeah. I don't know
yeah.
how I can repeat that again.
Yeah, yeah. No, it doesn't need to. It's not because you make it that it needs to look like a grade school art project, right? Like, yeah,
100%.
yeah. Okay, cool. Perfect. Yeah, just closing this out. Any shout outs you wanna do, Andrew, before we close out?
No, just Capital City Bloodbath if you're in the Ottawa area or to make the trip. It's at the end of August. We do have an Old World tournament happening there. So it'd be awesome for you guys to come check it out if you're able to. Other than that, I don't really have any other stuff to
Awesome.
shout out.
Yeah, I was gonna shout out. Well, I knew you were going to, but I'm also gonna shout out CCBB. Like, we'll be there. Ryan will also be there. So I think it'll be a great time for sure. It's one of the better events or the best events I've attended, really in my sort of wargaming slash hobby career, just in terms of the venue, all the amenities and stuff. So I would strongly endorse and recommend it. Obviously, Andrew's sitting here, so it would be awkward not to do so. But like really, from that's really heartfelt, and like I really think it's a great event, and I'd encourage everybody to come out. And then aside from that, you may hear from us again pretty shortly. As we mentioned in these sort of opening segments, we have a big GW preview in less than 48 hours at this point, depending on what's revealed there. We are going to be maybe having an emergency episode to cover that. And then we have an RTT that we're all attending this weekend, and we're probably going to record something after that, just talking about our impressions. We have like 25 players, I think, signed up for the event. So like
Yeah.
just seeing what kind of lists turn out and how everything plays out in the wild at an actual event will be super interesting. So yeah, those are two potential episodes that are coming out next. So yeah, we hope you enjoyed this one. Bit of a change of pace from our usual episodes. Half hard tactical stuff and then half hobbying. So we hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for being here with us. See you next time.
Thanks.